Alright, here I am wandering in the woods. I'm going to talk about the definition of a day today. A lot of Christians are lost in the woods. Lost in the woods when it comes to the definition of the day, or drowning in the swamp, as you can see here. And the reason for that is that the translators have messed up their most preferred or their most popular translation, which happens to be the King James Version. The King James Version is read by about 31% of readers, and when it comes to the definition of a day, it's relied on for almost 100% of readers. Because even if the more modern translations have somewhat corrected the problems of the King James, the more modern translations are interpreted the way the King James is written. In other words, the interpretation that's put on the King James Version is automatically put on the more modern translations. So 100% of the translations may as well as be wrong because nobody's corrected the way they get interpreted. The reason we need to understand the definition of the day is because without it, we cannot understand the timing of Messiah's death and resurrection. Using the King James Version definition of a day from sunset to sunset, we're going to end up with the wrong chronology. And also, even if people realize there needs to be 3 days and 3 nights in the chronology, the 3 days and the 3 nights will be computed incorrectly if the day is from sunset to sunset. So as we're going to find out in our study of the Hebrew here, the definition of a day, the calendar day actually that is from dawn to dawn. We will also discuss the definition of the literal day, which is what we would call the daylight portion of the day. Oh, here's a swamp I need to jump across there. Look at all that water. Quite swampy there. Yep, that's where I stepped by. So it's quite wet around here. So I've got to jump over this. The title of this video is Genesis 1:5, a Messianic Text. Well, most people don't think of it as a Messianic text, but it is because it gives us the definition of the day. And we need the definition of the day to understand Yeshua's rising from the dead on the third day, which means on the third calendar day, since we know that he rose while it was still night. If you don't know what the definition of a day is, you're going to get stuck in a swamp, just like this one. If I take the wrong path here, I'll end up trapped between the water bogs and the swamps here. Although it is a pretty sight and can be quite attractive if your religious leaders are teaching you the wrong definition. It seems like you're in the right, but that's the problem with tradition. If you don't check it out and see what its basis is, you're going to be deceived by it. And it's not just as if people have mistakenly made mistakes or made wrong turns. Actually, there are the powers that are at war with God's people, Israel. And these powers are led by the serpent that deceived Hava in the garden, or probably as we should pronounce it, Hawa in the garden. The serpent deceived her. Well, the serpent's still at work deceiving God's people. So he knows how to introduce mistakes and errors into the traditions. And if we're not on our guards, if the shepherds are not on their guards, these errors enter into the tradition, and then they become taken for granted. So the error is, in a sense, both a corporate error and an individual error. In a large sense, it's a corporate error. The leaders that should have been watching out for the flock didn't watch out. They didn't stay on guard. And of course, not everybody can be expected to study Hebrew or Greek or to be on guard. So it's not always the fault of the individual, or the flock, but the result is still the same. If the leaders aren't watching out, the flock is deceived. There's this attitude going around out there that God's people are always right, the leaders are always right, they cannot err, that God preserves the truth in the remnant 100%, and there never can be any mistakes. Well, that's a myth, because if you read Scripture, if people don't check with God first, if the leaders don't check with God, they can be deceived. Just like when Joshua and the elders of Israel trusted the Gibeonites and made a covenant with them not to destroy them. And then they found out that they only lived 3 days away in the land of Canaan, where they were supposed to destroy all of the people. They were deceived by a trick. The apple of God's eye, Israel, was deceived, and he let them suffer the consequences of that deceit for a long time. He made them keep their covenant that they had made, that they weren't supposed to make, because covenants are inviolable. Well, look at this mess we've worked ourselves into here. All that water. Can we get through it? More water. So there is a grand conspiracy run by the devil and his angels to deceive mankind, and they're most urgent in trying to deceive God's people. So we really have to watch out. It's not just human mistakes, it's just not human corruptions. It's actually the powers from below are working to corrupt everything and deceive everything. That's why corruption happens amazingly fast, just as our society is falling apart amazingly fast, seemingly faster than human beings can be giving account for. That's because they're being helped on their way by unseen powers. You know, a lot of Christians are under the impression that the devil doesn't tamper with their Bible translations, but in fact, he does. He's been tampering with them from the beginning of Bible translations. The first one was the Septuagint, the translation of the Torah made into Greek. There's lots of differences and lots of liberties the translators took with the Hebrew in translating the Septuagint. The devil has even attacked the Hebrew language, coming up with false theories, which have now been debunked by patient scholarship, such as the wav conversive theory, the idea that wav with the imperfect converts to past tense, converts the imperfect to the past tense, and the idea that wav with the perfect converts it to the future tense. That's a myth, and some of this is going to be coming out as I tell you, go through Hebrew texts, and you'll be able to figure it out. It says the evening and the morning were one day, and that isn't even remotely like the Hebrew. It switches everything around and changes it into something that it's not. So here's quite a swampy area in the bog here on Washington Island, and we're going to get ourselves out of the swamp. See this new growth here? That represents a renewal, new plant life. Well, God's people have erred corporately. Leaders didn't watch out. The people were led astray. God lets things run down for a while. That's the history of Scripture. But you know what? He steps in to redeem his people corporately as a whole at various junctures in history. This is an important principle to realize, because only when God steps in is there actually a renewal. There can be renewal on an individual basis also, but that's different from the corporate times that God intervenes with his people. Individual salvation is available, and also corporate salvation, but we have to wait for the latter sometimes. Sometimes God lets his people wallow in deception and ignorance for a long time. But there's hope. God does step in before it's too late. As it says, he will not be too late. So now, let's go back to the studio and I will show you. All right, here I've drawn a sketch of the traditional Friday to Sunday view. And as we see, it has 2 nights, 1, 2, and they get 3 days by counting part, a whole, and a part, Counting parts is okay, but they still need part of the daytime to get the third day. Otherwise, they would only end up with 2 days, a whole and a part, and none here. So they need to count 1, 2, 3. The biggest problem, however, is no third night. And of course, the scripture says the resurrection was on the first of the Sabbaths, which is not Sunday, but it's over here. All right, let's look at the next view. False view number 2. If you do believe the crucifixion was on a Wednesday, and you hold the definition of a day being used with the 3 days is from sunset to sunset, then you're going to end up with this view. 1, 2, 3, and the third day is going to be Sabbath afternoon, the daytime part of the Sabbath. So it requires a resurrection to be in the daytime, some believing at 3 p.m. and others believing at sunset, so they could squeeze it, just eke it out, squeeze it out on the first day of the week. But again, the scripture says it was on the first of the Sabbaths, and it also places the time of the women's arrival at the tomb at the earliest dawn, which means the resurrection was in the nighttime. So as you can see, this view requires to have it, the resurrection over here requires a definition of the day that goes from sunset to sunset. But as we're going to see in our study of Genesis, the Genesis day is not from sunset to sunset. The Genesis day is from dawn to dawn, and that's what we need to have the proper definition of the day for Messiah's death and resurrection. Here we have the correct view. He died on a Wednesday afternoon during the daytime, and this counts as the first day. Thursday and Friday is the third day, and then the nights are Wednesday night, Thursday night, and Friday night. And of course, Friday night is on the Sabbath. This was the first of the Sabbaths. Okay, as I have explained in other videos. And the resurrection was in the night, and the women came at dawn, even before the daytime part of the day began. So this is what we're going to discuss. And we're going to show from Genesis that the day was from dawn to dawn. That is, the calendar day was from dawn to dawn. Just to show you that I'm not alone in this opinion, I will show you what the theological word book of the Old Testament says. This is found under the definition of Erev, evening. The phrase, there was an evening and there was a morning, occurs 6 times in the creation narrative, delimiting the 6 days of divine creative activity. The phrase would indicate that in ancient Israel a day began with sunrise, not sunset. Some have felt this at variance with the Jewish practice of regarding sunset as the beginning of the next day. Cassuto, after dealing with the biblical data and the Jewish custom, concludes that there was only one system of computing time. The day is considered to begin in the morning. But in regard to the festivals and appointed times, the Torah ordains that they shall be observed also on the night of the preceding day. Umberto Cassuto, Genesis 1, page 29, his emphasis. We will see that even the ESV Study Bible supports the day beginning at dawn, as we see in this footnote on Genesis chapter 1. There was evening and there was morning, the first day. The order, evening, then morning, helps the reader to follow the flow of the passage. After the work day, verse 3 through 5a, the work day, which would be the literal day, that's verses 3 through 5a. After that, there is an evening and then there is a morning, implying that there is a night time, the worker's daily rest in between. Thus, the reader is prepared for the next work day, to dawn. So it regards the day as beginning at dawn, even in the ESV Study Bible. Okay, I've opened up the screen recorder on BibleHub.com here to the online interlinear. I have taken the liberty here to conform all the English in the interlinear to the King James translation. And not only that, but I've added some numbers here to give the word order. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. Here it is again out of the King James Bible. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. Okay, the first problem is with the first word, and. Remember how I've been telling you about the wav consecutive? Yomer, the wav consecutive doesn't strictly speaking mean and. It means then, as in then next. So we are going to fix that problem. Also, the imperfect, which is what this is, as you can see from the grammatical code, is strictly speaking a present tense or future tense. In this case, it's a present. So says would be the right translation. So let's fix these two right here. There we go. Then says. Now let's fix God here. Strictly speaking, Elohim means almighty. Intensive plural, and the root Eloah means mighty or powerful. Therefore, most mighty or almighty. English requires a definite article here. Alright, I made things a little bigger so it's easier to see. Then the Almighty says. We can follow the numbers still here. Let there be. You do not have to modify this. This is adjussive, let there, or it's a modal, may there be, imperative, third person imperative. Let there be. Light. We don't have to change anything here either. And there was. We have the wav consecutive here. We also have the past tense problem here. The imperfect takes the form of the present tense, strictly speaking. Then there is. Yehi, or light. Nothing wrong here. Again, we have a wav consecutive here. Then sees. The Almighty. Direct object marker. We don't need to translate it. That just means what follows is the object of the verb, and it's definite. Ha-or. The light. Ha, meaning the, or meaning light. Ki, that. Tov, good. It was good. It was good. This should be present tense. The present tense we're using here is called the historical present tense. There are actually some English authors that will tell their entire story in the present tense, as if it is from the standpoint of the present. One such author is the author of the Hunger Games book. So a present tense narrative for past history is not unprecedented in English. In Hebrew, it's the norm. Vayavdel. Again, we have a wav consecutive here. And also, this is a heful. So I will reflect that in the translation. Alright, the causative element of the heful, I have used the present tense verb makes to show a dividing. I have also used a participle ing to show the present sense of the imperfect. Makes a dividing. So at this point in time, a dividing was being made by God between the light and the darkness. The Almighty. One could simply say Almighty here without the definite article. Then Almighty makes a dividing, or then Elohim makes a dividing. The is for the sake of English. The word is definite, nevertheless, with or without the definite article, because it's a proper noun. Alright, we have the word bane. Although this is not relevant to the argument, if we look up in Nehemiah 5:18, according to Kohler's lexicon, this word means an interval of, or an interval between certain things. I think an interval sense makes better sense in this passage in Genesis, so we will translate it that way. Please note that the King James omitted the translation here. Then the Almighty makes a dividing, an interval of the light, and an interval of the darkness. The word, as the King James has it, from, but it definitely does not mean from. It means an interval of, or and between the darkness. Again, this point is not relevant to our argument, but for the sake of accuracy, I'm going to translate ubain as an interval of, taking bain as construct in this case. Alright, the significance of this wav consecutive. Then the Almighty makes a dividing, an interval of the light and an interval of the darkness, is that he, in this point in time, set in motion the process which would cause a cycle of day and a cycle of night to alternate with each other. If we were to translate this between the light and between the darkness, we could come up with an alternative interpretation, meaning that the light he created was dawn, a dawning or a mixed with darkness light, a dawning light, and that he separated the dawn from the darkness that it contained to bring full light, the full light of full day, without any darkness. I prefer the interpretation of setting a day and night cycle in motion as the meaning of this dividing. In other words, a dividing in time. Vayikra, here we have another wav consecutive and another imperfect. Vayikra Elohim. Then the Almighty calls. La'or, the light. Preposition, definite article represented by the vowel. La'or, actually the he and ha contracts, leaving its vowel. La'or. So the light is proper. This lamed here is not translated, and probably correctly so, not translated. It's probably just marking the direct object, so we'll interpret it the same way. So there's nothing to do here. Yom, day. Velachoshech, and the darkness. The, or wa, velachoshech. We have a wav conjunctive here, so we don't translate it then. The difference between the wav conjunctive and the wav consecutive. This wav consecutive is usually wa and puts a dagesh in the yod and doubles it. Also, it's attached to a verb. The wav conjunctive is attached to a noun phrase. V'lachoshech, and the darkness. Kara, he called. This is a perfect. This represents a change of verb tense. Generally speaking, all the translators render the imperfects and the perfects as a simple past tense in English, obliterating any distinction between the Hebrew tenses. I do not do so in my translation. I represent the imperfect with the present tense, and I represent the perfect with the perfect tense. So we will do that here. V'lachoshech kara, and the darkness he has called Laila, night. And the sentence ends. Vayehi, and the narrative picks up with a imperfect again. That makes this statement with the kara, or the perfect, parenthetical. It's supplying background information which is off the timeline. That's why there's no wav consecutive here. So let's put some parentheses around the phrase to show this. Velachoshech kara laila, and the darkness he has called night. In English, we might illustrate this change of tense device like this. I'll tell a little story to show by example. John went to bed. John went to sleep. John woke up. John put his shoes on. John made breakfast. John hates eggs. John finished his breakfast. John had porridge and not eggs. John went to work. That's the end of the story. Now, and the phrase John hates eggs is a present tense verb mixed up with a narrative of past tense verbs. The past tense verbs give the story timeline. The phrase John hates eggs is actually off the timeline. It doesn't say when he hated eggs. It doesn't say that he hated eggs then or even thought about it then. It's just a truism, a timeless statement that could be specifically assigned to really any time that it may be true. That's the case here with the change up of tenses between the imperfect and the perfect. The Hebrew uses the perfect for backgrounding information, for timeless statements that are always true. So when it says he has called the darkness night, it means that that's what he does. It does not mean he did it then. The parenthetical phrase, shown by the parentheses here, Velachoshech kara laila, parentheses, is off the sequence line. It's off the timeline. This is just background information. If you are interested in more information on this way of using the perfect to background information, I suggest the book, The Semantics of Aspect and Modality, Evidence from English and Biblical Hebrew, by Galia Hatav. Galia Hatav is a linguist who did her research in Hebrew at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and she explains this idea of backgrounding information. Let us now go to the next phrase, Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Voker, Yom Echad. What we will see here is this is the place where the King James Version really messes up. I have put in the King James translation in the interlinear here, and the evening and the morning were the first day. We will notice first that in Vayehi, King James only translates the wa, and this is a wa consecutive, but it doesn't represent it as wav consecutive. It completely ignores the verb at this location. It puts a definite article in front of evening, which is not needed. Evening could also be translated grew dark or setting. It repeats the error here, translating the wa as a conjunctive, wa, when it's a wa consecutive. Then it ignores the verb, yahi. And again, voker does not require the definite article in English here, but the King James puts it in. Yom, echad. The King James takes the verb that it should have translated here, and it transports it over to here. Were the first day. This way, it changes the definition of the day by defining the evening and the morning interval as the first day. This requires reinterpretation of the meaning of the word evening, which strictly means only as the sun is going down or as it is growing dark or completely dark. And it also requires the reinterpretation of morning, which only means the daybreak or the first part of day during dawn. The reinterpretation that readers have foisted upon the text is to think that evening is the whole night and the morning is the whole next day, forming a sunset to sunset day. We will see that when we straighten the Hebrew out, the exact opposite is the truth, especially when we pay attention to the wav consecutive. So let's start by repairing Vayehi. Then there is, just like we did before. Then there is, Vayehi. Evening. We can delete the definite article. Erev. I have translated Erev as setting, in the sense of growing dark or the going down of the light, which is strictly what Erev means in Hebrew. The afternoon can be called Bein HaErevim, between the settings, the first Erev being when the sun begins to go down, and the second Erev being actual sunset. This Erev here probably refers to the setting of the light, or the disappearance of the light altogether. Vayehi, the same as here. The Yehi was not translated by the King James, or it was, but it was transported way over here. Then there is morning, boker. The word boker in Hebrew actually has a narrower, more stricter meaning than morning in English. Morning in English can refer to time after midnight and time up to noon. That is way too broad for Hebrew. The word boker in Hebrew is very much closer to the idea of daybreak, so we will translate it daybreak. And the break idea in daybreak actually is related to the root meaning of boker, yom, echad. And here we shall have to delete the were and the definite article. Strictly speaking, echad means one. But as we see, it's used here for first. The days of creation are counted 1, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. When normally, if we were to use all ordinal numbers, we would count 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so on. Here, a cardinal number, 1, is being used to count the first day. 1, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so on. I will translate it literally in this case. Day 1. This is clearly a noun-adjective relationship. Day being noun, and the word echad after it functioning as an adjective. So I will put some numbers on it to indicate an English order. There we go. In English, we put adjectives first. 1 day. Then there is setting. Then there is daybreak. 1 day. All right, let's go over this again. Vayomer Elohim. Then says the Almighty, let there be light. So the first event that happens, the first wav consecutive in Scripture, after the setting is given in Genesis 1 and 2, is Vayomer Elohim. Then says the Almighty, let there be light. So the light begins to dawn. Then the Almighty sees the light, that it is good. Recognizing that the light is good, he makes a dividing between the day and the night, or he makes an interval of the light and an interval of the darkness, keeping the light interval separate from the darkness interval. Notice the order of events here. An interval of the light and the interval of the darkness. The interval of the darkness coming after the interval of the light. The order is important here. Then the Almighty calls the light day. Notice again that first he calls the light day, and then off the timeline he has called the darkness night. It's off the timeline, because it interrupts the narrative of imperfects. It's also just a general truth. Welachoshek kara laila. Let's look at then the Almighty calls the light day here. This is talking about the literal day, the daylight, from dawn to dusk, which is separate from the darkness, which is called night, lila. So that is our first definition of day, a literal day, dawn to dusk. Then we have the interval of the night, marked off by the setting and the daybreak, Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Boker, or Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Boker. Between the Vayehi Erev and the Vayehi Boker is the nighttime. Then, finally, Yom Echad, one day. This is a calendar day, a full interval of day followed by night, one day. Yom Echad. Yom Echad brings us up to the beginning of the next day in Genesis 1, verse 6. The Almighty creates during the day, and during the nights he does nothing. Each day of Genesis ends with the frame, Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Boker, bringing us up to daybreak or dawn of the next day. So we see that the end of the calendar day, where the summation is made, Yom Echad, is placed at the end of the night and at the beginning of the dawn of the next day. Vayehi Erev, then there is setting. It is important to realize that this Erev, or setting, follows the day in the narrative, whereas in the King James it has reversed the order and it makes you think of the primordial darkness as the first evening. But the primordial darkness cannot be the first evening, because Erev means the setting, or growing dark, or the going away of the light. So we see that contrary to what the King James suggests, the day in Genesis chapter 1, the calendar day, is defined from one daybreak to the next daybreak, from the dawning creation of light to the next dawn, one day. This isn't the only scripture that supports the dawn-to-dawn day. There are many other scriptures. The reason that people do not see them is because their mind has been reprogrammed by the King James mistranslation. All right, in the back of the Good News and Messiah translation, I have a chart of the 3 days and 3 nights and Resurrection Sabbath. Dawn-to-dawn days, the first of the 3 days, today, dawn to dawn. The second of the 3 days, tomorrow, dawn to dawn. The third of the 3 days, the third day. 1, 2, 3. Day before night, day 1, night 1. Day 2, night 2. Day 3, night 3. We have Wednesday, March 24th, AD 34, crucifixion on day 1. We have Thursday, Friday, and then the Sabbath beginning Friday evening. Night 3, we have the resurrection toward the end of the third night. Then the women go to the tomb on the first of the Sabbaths, or the later of the Sabbaths, which is the weekly Sabbath. And we see that this follows the pattern of the Genesis calendar day, from dawn to dawn, dawn to dawn. And we have literal days, dawn to dusk, day 1, day 2, day 3. The 3 days and 3 nights, we have the nights. Again, notice the order in 3 days and 3 nights, days before nights. The calendar day is dawn to dawn, and the Sabbaths go with the night preceding. So we have the annual Sabbath and the weekly Sabbath. So now that you understand the Genesis day, you can understand how the 3 days and the 3 nights work.